Chapter 15: Prime Minister and Constitutional Reform. In the role of leader of a majority party in the Assembly, which had been elected under a bogus and fraudulent constitution that in no way satisfied the political aspirations of my party, my task was not an enviable one. The Kusi constitution had not been formulated with the idea of a party system developing in the country. The post of leader of government business had not been planned with a view to Africans taking over the government, and in fact, by winning the 1951 election with such a majority and by forming the government, the position of leader of government business had already become redundant. Even the Times, as early as the 17th of February 1951, pointed out the need for the creation of the post of Prime Minister. When commenting on the title of Leader of Government Business, it observed that under the Kusi Constitution there is no provision for a Prime Minister. That dignity exists only when the highest ministerial office is combined with the leadership of the predominant party in the legislature. Party members insisted strongly that my title should be changed to that of Prime Minister. There was much criticism about it, as the general feeling was that merely renaming the present post of Leader of Government Business to Prime Minister would not change the real substance of the Constitution. I maintained, however, that there was something in a name, that as Prime Minister it would be necessary to abide by the conventions that go to make a Prime Minister, and that since my position in the Assembly as the leader of the government was consequent upon leadership of the majority party, the post of Prime Minister was definitely called for. Eventually we won the day. On the afternoon of the 5th of March 1952, the governor addressed a crowded meeting of the Legislative Assembly as follows. Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I have come here this afternoon on your invitation to inform you of the text of a statement about further constitutional changes in the Gold Coast, which the Secretary of State for the Colonies has just made in the House of Commons. This is the statement. In the light of the working of the present Constitution and on the advice of the Governor, Her Majesty's Government has decided that the leader of government business in the Legislative Assembly should disappear from the Constitution, and that the office of Prime Minister should be formally recognized. The Governor will consult the Prime Minister before submitting to the Assembly the names of the persons whom he proposes for appointment as representative members of the Executive Council or Cabinet, and before allocating to them portfolios. The Prime Minister will rank in precedence in the Cabinet immediately after the Governor, or the officer administering the government, as the case may be, and before any of the three ex officio ministers whose position in other respects will remain unchanged. The necessary amendment to the constitutional instrument to give effect to this and other consequential changes will be made very shortly. That is the end of the statement. This message was received with resounding cheers and applause. Congratulations poured into my office, to the party headquarters and to the Assembly from all quarters of the globe. As soon as I could escape the crowds, I went home so that my mother could share with me this joyous news. What does it feel like to be the mother of the first African Prime Minister? I teased her. She looked at me and gave a grunt as if to say, "What will you be up to next?" But there was no hiding the look of pride that suddenly lit up those poor strained eyes. Following the announcement of my appointment as Prime Minister, the Executive Council resigned, and in consultation with the Governor, I created a new instrument of government to be known from henceforth as the Cabinet. This was submitted to the Legislative Assembly for approval. On the 21st of March, the Legislative Assembly approved my appointment as Prime Minister and also the appointments as representative members of the Cabinet of the following: Kojo Botsio as Minister of Education and Social Welfare, K.A. Bedema as Minister of Commerce and Industry, A. Casey Hayford as Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources, E.O. Asafu Ajay as Minister of Local Government, J.A. Brymer as Minister of Communications and Works, T. Hutton Mills as Minister of Health and Labour, and finally Answer Coy as Minister of Housing. I elected to become Minister of Development in addition to my duties as Prime Minister. The task now facing us was the final struggle for complete independence and the formation of a policy for action, both inside and outside the Assembly, in order to achieve this aim. Meanwhile, certain amendments to the Constitution had to be carried out which would fit in with the conditions existing in this transitional period through which we would have to pass before the attainment of full self-government. This was, one might say, a probationary period wherein we had to prove our worth and demonstrate ability to manage our own affairs. I initiated discussions with the governor on the subject of these amendments to the Constitution, and when in June of that year, 1952, Mr. Oliver Littleton, then Secretary of State for the Colonies, paid a visit to the country, I took the matter further. I pointed out that we desired full self-government and that in order to work satisfactorily during the transitional period before our goal was reached, certain constitutional changes were necessary. Mr. Littleton agreed that when proposals had been formulated by the Gold Coast government after consultation with the chiefs and people of the country, they would be examined and discussed by Her Majesty's government and the government of the Gold Coast. This showed clearly that in order to gain our independence, it was incumbent upon the Gold Coast government to take the initiative. In other words, the government should initiate consultation with the chiefs and the people of the Gold Coast as to the necessary changes in the Kusi Constitution. The first step that I took in regard to the consultation was to make a statement in the Legislative Assembly in October. I began by mentioning the principal features of the present Constitution, which, in the light of experience gained during the past 21 months during which it had been in operation, showed that it should be reviewed and amended. It was necessary to examine the matter fully, I said, so that it could never be said at a later date, either inside or outside the Gold Coast, the proposals which we would eventually make to the United Kingdom government were based, not on our part, on a full realization of the issue at stake. The object of the consultations was to enable discussions to take place between our government and that of the United Kingdom, and the proposals that we put forward should indicate clearly what further functions and responsibilities we considered we should now assume. I urge strongly that those who took part in the consultations, whatever interest, party, or group they represented, should participate with a proper sense of the gravity of the issues involved. It was important that we conducted our discussions with statesmanship of a high order and avoided every idle or ill-considered word, whether spoken or written. I dealt first with the question of the ex officio members. We should consider, I said, whether these 3 members should be retained in the cabinet or replaced by representative ministers. In the case of the ex officio Minister of Finance, if he were replaced by a representative minister, the government would have to ensure that expert financial advice continued to be available. This could best be done by appointing a financial and economic advisor to the government, who would attend cabinet meetings when required, but would have no vote and would be a member neither of the cabinet nor of the assembly. The present ex officio Minister of Justice combined his duties with that of Attorney General, the government's legal advisor. It was possible to dispose of the position of Minister of Justice and appoint an Attorney General who would continue to be the legal advisor of the government, who would attend cabinet meetings when required to, but would have no vote and would be a member neither of the cabinet nor of the assembly. With regard to the ex officio Minister of Defense and External Affairs, if you were replaced by a representative minister, one implication would be that the Gold Coast was prepared to take over immediately full responsibility for its own defense, the main burden of which, I pointed out, was borne by the armed naval, military, and air forces of the Commonwealth. We possessed only a very small military force and contributed only a proportion of its cost. Another implication would be the maintenance and protection of our external trade relations would cease to be the direct responsibility of the United Kingdom and would become our own concern. We would have to be responsible for our own direct representation in the foreign countries with which we traded, and be in a position to protect our trade with foreign countries from discriminatory practices. It is for the chiefs and people, I said, bearing these implications in mind, to consider whether all or any of the ex officio ministers should be replaced by representative ministers. I pointed out that at present the appointment of the Prime Minister and of his representative ministers depended on the resolutions of the Assembly, that the name of the Prime Minister was proposed by the Governor and those of the representative ministers by the Governor after consultation with the Prime Minister. It would be more in accordance with British constitutional practice, I said, if the Prime Minister were free to select his representative colleagues without a resolution of the Assembly, the Governor having no power to reject his choice. I also suggested that in accordance with British practice, the appointment of Prime Minister should depend not on a resolution of the Assembly, but on his willingness and ability to form a majority government at the invitation of the Governor. If such a change took place, it would follow that the Prime Minister would be the authority, when occasion arose, for deciding whether any representative minister should be removed from office. It is for the chiefs and the people to consider whether there should now be any change in the procedure for appointing the Prime Minister and other representative ministers, and, if so, what that change should be, I declared. With regard to the assignment of portfolios, this was clearly a question which would have to be considered in light of any constitutional change that might be introduced affecting the continuance of the ex officio ministers and the appointment of representative ministers. I then turned to the constitution of the Legislative Assembly. The Assembly, I pointed out, consisted of 3 ex officio members, 6 special members, of whom only 2 had a vote, and 75 other members. Of the 56 members representing the colony, Ashanti, and Southern Togoland, 18, or 1/3, represented the chiefs and traditional authorities and were elected not by universal adult suffrage, but by the Joint Provincial Council, the Asante-Man Council, and the Transvolta Southern Togoland Electoral College. The 19 members representing the Northern Territories were elected by a system peculiar to the Northern Territories. Constituencies varied in size and their representation in the Assembly was disproportionate. It is for the chiefs and people, I said, to consider whether the Assembly, as at present constituted, affords the best representation of the country which can be devised, and whether a second House should be established, and if so, what its constitution and powers should be. It was clear that a commission of inquiry would have to be established to look into representational and electoral reform, and it was for the chiefs and the people to consider what the composition and terms of reference of this commission should be. Part 5 of the Constitutional Order in Council, which dealt with legislative and procedure in the Assembly, contained a provision which gave power to the government. The governor, acting in his discretion to control the introduction of any bill or motion which, in the opinion of the Speaker or the Attorney General, would provide for the final determination of local constitutional matters otherwise than by the governor acting in his discretion. It is for the chiefs and people to consider, I said, whether there should be any change in the provisions of this part of the order relating to bills or motions for determination, otherwise than by the governor of questions relating to the following local constitutional matters. A. The election, installation, deposition, or abdication of any chief, or the right of any person to take part in any such election, installation, or deposition. B. The recovery or delivery of stool property in connection with any such election, installation, deposition, or abdication. And C. Political or constitutional relations between chiefs under native customary law. Part 6 of the Order in Council, I continued, prescribed certain safeguards for the public service designed to protect the service from political influence or control. The service was controlled by the governor, acting in his discretion, and provision was made for the establishment of an independent public service commission advisory to the governor. The order did not preclude the assembly from exercising its control over the establishment of the public service. It should be borne in mind that the service was the instrument of government policy, without which that policy could not be carried into effect. Although political advance had outstripped the advance of Africanization, it should be remembered that the civil service, designed to perpetuate the best British tradition, should be kept free from political influence. The preservation of high standards in the public service was an administrative question, and no opinion could faithfully be given to the revision of the provisions of the Constitution under reference without carefully giving study to 1. The prospective rate of Africanization in relation to future requirements, 2. The extent to which overseas officers were and must for some time continue to be a necessity, 3. The effect on serving officers and on future recruitment of any change in the present safeguards, and the probability that, if any material diminution of existing safeguards were accepted by the United Kingdom government, that acceptance would be on terms which would stipulate the payment for compensation for loss of career to serving officers. It is for the chiefs and people, having taken all those factors into account, to consider whether the provisions of the Constitution relating to the public service should be altered, and if so, in what respect. It was possible, I went on, that the chiefs and people would find other questions on which they wished to express their opinions, and these would be welcomed. The government would not formulate its policy in regard to the questions I had mentioned until the fullest opportunity had been allowed for consultation, and until the government had studied the views submitted to it. In order to prevent the preliminary discussions from being influenced by a declaration of government policy, I had refrained from putting forward a statement of government policy in advance of the consultations that were to take place. I proposed to send copies of my statement to every council, political party, or representative group throughout the country, inviting them to submit their views to my office by the end of March. These written statements would be collated and published. The government would then formulate its views and embody them in a white paper for debate at the end of the June meeting of the Assembly. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I concluded, I would remind honourable members and everyone who reads this statement that we are now, in response to the invitation of the Secretary of State given our request, embarking on an enterprise which imposes a very heavy responsibility on all who participate in it. The responsibility lies most heavily on the government, which must ultimately determine, in the light of the views which the country after due deliberation expresses, the proposals which are to be conveyed to the United Kingdom government. The world, which is both critical and sympathetic, will watch with the closest attention how we deal with this problem. All I ask of the chiefs and people is that they should place at the disposal of the government the best advice that they can give. 131 organizations submitted their views by the end of March. The territorial councils, the Ghana Congress Party, the Ghana Nationalist Party, and the Gold Coast Trades Union Congress all disagreed with the proposed method of consulting the chiefs and people on desired amendments to the Constitution. I had to follow this procedure, however, because the Legislative Assembly, under the Kusi Constitution, was not a fully elected assembly. These discussions and consultations formed the basis of the government's White Paper on Constitutional Reform of 1953, which, in its turn, after months of negotiations with the Secretary of State, formed the basis of this present constitution, which is commonly known as the Nkrumah Constitution, but which I prefer to call the Nkrumah-Arden-Clark Constitution. This did not come into being for a year after the publication of the white paper, and in the meantime I battled on as best as I could. Soon after the October statement, I went on a tour of the country to see how the organization of the party was progressing. I was greatly encouraged to find widespread enthusiasm for and mass solidarity behind the party. I stressed the importance of new local and urban councils working in close harmony with the people who had elected them. For I said that independent and vigorous local government is the only staying power of free and democratic self-government, and that it was our aim to foster the growth of such institutions. I took note of the most urgent needs of the people in the towns and villages through which I passed, and returned with a long list of requirements: roads, schools, hospitals, dispensaries, water supplies, post offices, telephones, and houses. On my return to Accra in November, I called an emergency delegates conference of the CPP in order to discuss vital matters affecting the solidarity of the party. I reported to the meeting that the results of my recent countrywide tour, and impressed upon the delegates that today, more than ever before, our predominant slogan should be organize, for the task that lay ahead of us was a very arduous one. Despite our present political achievement, I pointed out that to pass through the next phase successfully, we would have to make sure that we were well organized, strong, and formidable. The next phase of our political advancement may entail general elections, I warned, and we cannot afford to rest on our oars because of present achievements. We were in the unfortunate position of having 2 trades union congresses in the country. No army can strike effectively if its forces are divided and fighting against themselves. Even though each TUC was 100% in support of the CPP, I insisted that the movement must be led by only one Congress. I told them that I had recommended that a committee for industrial organization should be set up to help promote trade unionism in the country. I then referred to my recent statement in the Assembly on Constitutional Reform. I told them that I had made that statement as Prime Minister and head of the government of the day, but that I was addressing them now as Life Chairman of the CPP and leader of the party. The proposal I was about to put to them on behalf of the national executive of the party did not detract from the undertaking I gave on behalf of the government that the views of the chiefs and people and of other political groups would be fully considered before the final proposals were formulated. It had been decided by the national executive, I said, that the delegates' conference there assembled should recommend that the government of the Gold Coast make representations to the Queen in council, through the Secretary of State for the Colonies, that the chiefs and the people of the Gold Coast demand immediate self-government, and that an Act of Independence be simultaneously passed by the United Kingdom Parliament and the Gold Coast Legislative Assembly, declaring the Gold Coast to be, under the new name of Ghana, a sovereign and independent state with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as head of state. This suggestion was received enthusiastically. I felt that unless the pot was kept constantly stirred, the contents would go stale. I knew from experience how long it took to get anything done, especially when the ideas involved were somewhat revolutionary. But if a constant agitation were kept up, I could not see how we would fail to reach the goal of independence.